Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shaakirrah Sanders. I am a professor of law at the University of Idaho College of Law. I teach constitutional law, criminal procedure, and the First Amendment. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's City Club of Boise virtual conversation, Critical Race Theory and Context, Politics in America's Schools. I want to welcome our radio listeners who will be joining us via Boise State Public Radio on KBSX 91.5 and its affiliates throughout Southern Idaho and Northern Nevada. This program is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel as well. Today's forum is available for our audience in large part because of City Club sponsors and partners. I would like to thank some of the organizations that help make our programming possible. Our premier sponsor is Northwest Nazarene University and the NNU College of Business. Our annual sponsor is the University of Idaho. We also receive support from our forum series sponsors, which include AARP Idaho, Bank of Idaho, Climatech Corporation, Echelon Group, Micron, Pacific Source Health Plans, Small Mine Development, and St. Luke Hospital System. The City Club of Boise receives grant funding from the Idaho Humanities Council. We'd like to also thank our media partners, which include Boise State Public Radio, 670 KBOI, Idaho Statesman, and Idaho Public Television, and our university partners, BSU and NNU. We would also like to acknowledge the ancestral, cultural, traditional, and unceded territory of the Shoshone, Bannock, and Northern Paiute people, upon which many of us are meeting today. Finally, I'd like to thank the members of City Club of Boise, more than 500 individuals and organizations. If you are listening now and are not a member, I encourage you to join today. For our audience, please remember there will be an opportunity for your panel to respond to your questions today. You can use the Q&A function of Zoom to type your question in, or you can email Morgan at cityclubofboise.org. Again, that's MORGAN at cityclubofboise.org, and it will provide it. Morgan will send your questions to me, and I'll do my very best to present each question, and I may also group similar questions together in order to save time. Now, on to our program, today's topic, the controversy surrounding critical race theory, or CRIT. This once esoteric academic legal theory is now making headlines, affecting funding for public schools and universities, shaping the composition of local school boards and curricula, and impacting state and local elections. We've assembled a panel of experts to help us sort all of this out. Our first panelist is Dr. Kevin Bruyneel, who is a professor of politics at Babson College. Our next panelist is Dr. Adam Laats, a professor of teaching, learning, and educational leadership at Binghamton University, which is part of the SUNY system of universities. Our final panelist is Emma Pettit, who is a senior reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education. I am so excited to have all of you here with us today. I'm going to give each panelist about 5 to 7 minutes to speak. I'm going to go in the reverse order of our introductions. So Emma Pettit, why don't you go first? And I want to also pre-apologize for any mispronunciations of your name. Please feel free to inform our audience of the proper pronunciation. So Emma, go ahead.
No problem. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. So my name's Emma Pettit, and I'm a senior reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education. I've been writing a bit about the critical race theory controversy as it involves higher education, and I thought it'd be helpful to kind of just give a brief overview of how this got on our radar as a newsroom, a bit about what's happened since in terms of the legislation that has been presented or passed in various state legislatures, and a bit about how universities themselves are interpreting those edicts or suggestions from lawmakers that they take critical race theory and indoctrination seriously within their institutions. So for just a little bit of background, I wrote a story, I think back in March, that got a bit into the origins of not critical race theory itself, but more about where the controversy came from. So I'll just go over that quickly. It's helpful to know that basically, a lot of it stems to one person, a man named Christopher Rufo, who's a conservative pundit and a writer. He was writing for a couple of different places back in the summer of 2020, when he says he was tipped off to what he calls an abusive training on race that was happening in Seattle city government. And it was a DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion training. And so he wrote a story about basically warning of what he called a new racial orthodoxy taking over American institutions. He wrote similar stories and also called on then President Donald Trump to issue an executive order that banned federal agencies from, quote, teaching the toxic principles of critical race theory, race essentialism, and neo-segregationism. And so that got a ton of attention. He went on Tucker Carlson Tonight, I believe a couple of times, and talked about these issues, and Trump was actually watching, as he often did. The next day, Rufo was contacted by Mark Meadows and sent him over a bunch of his research. And later that month, that's when Trump spoke at the National Archives Museum and said that college students are being inundated with critical race theory, which is a, quote, Marxist doctrine, holding that America is a wicked and racist nation. And that's where the ban of the 9 or 10 divisive concepts came from, was that initial executive order. And so it was an order put out that basically said that federal contractors cannot train on those concepts. And at the time, there was a lot of concern among colleges that weren't sure if they fell under this executive order, what their reaction should be. There were a couple of institutions that I think were kind of just in a holding pattern. Some came out and kind of defended critical race theory as, you know, a long time topic of scholarly interest within the academy, and said that they would not be shying away from teaching these subjects. The executive order was blocked by a judge, I believe a district judge, and then the Biden administration repealed it. But a bunch of conservative think tanks and interest groups got behind the idea of the divisive concepts, became very interested in it. You know, the Goldwater Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the American Legislative Exchange Council, they've held forums on this sort of thing. And then you see the proliferation of bills in state houses. And there's a couple of trackers of that legislation that are useful. We have one at the Chronicle. There's one that's done by Christopher Rufo, and another one done by the Truth Be Told campaign, which is part of the African American Policy Forum. The bills really differ from state to state in terms of what they're trying to do, if they're just related to K through 12 or to higher education as well. So I recommend, if you're interested, looking up those trackers and looking at bills, not just that have been floated for the 2021 legislative session, but a lot have been pre-filed for 2022, because this is still very much an ongoing issue. So you kind of see this explode in, I'm not sure the current number of how many bills have been passed, but I think it's around 14 or 15. It's quite a lot. And meanwhile, like, people who are operating in the higher ed space are obviously taking note, especially at public institutions, are taking note of what lawmakers are thinking and asking and banning about this topic. One example that I wrote about was a regent on the Nebraska Board of Regents who coincidentally, or perhaps not coincidentally, is running for governor of the state of Nebraska. He put forward a measure to the full board that was a kind of a sort of ban of teaching critical race theory. I don't have the exact wording of that proposal in front of me, but it was discussed as a full board and ultimately voted down. And Ted Carter, the system president, gave a pretty strong defense of why, free inquiry and why that topic is important. They don't want to ban any topic at the University of Nebraska, and said that it's not, critical race theory is not a required topic by any means for undergraduate students, but it's well within the realm of reasonable for the institution to pursue and to support. And so that died down a little bit, although they're still kind of engulfed in some controversy over like diversity education. Another recent example that I just wrote about last week was a University of Florida professor who said that internally administrators encourage scholars not to put forward a doctoral concentration that would include critical and race in the title. It was a concentration that had been basically in effect for several years for students who wanted to focus on those topics, but they wanted to make it more formalized. And through a series of meetings, this professor has alleged, and other professors also said, that it was encouraged that they stay away from that topic until the legislative session is over and they can presumably undertake something that's considered controversial. So it's clear that this has become a political, I don't know what the right word is, punching bag, or a topic that a lot of state lawmakers are paying attention to, that brings about all sorts of issues for public institutions. Especially, it's clear that university administrators are, if not directly changing their actions, then at least being a little bit more wary or concerned, or have their feelers out in terms of what could potentially peeve conservative lawmakers in their state. And we've also briefly covered what it's like to be a critical race scholar in the classroom right now, especially in states where this legislation is pending, how professors are increasingly feeling a sense of someone watching over their shoulder, potential complaints, especially from students. So that's all very active right now. That's kind of the lay of the land as far as what the Chronicle has been covering. And I will now turn it over to another panelist.
Thank you, Emma Pettit. My apologies for mispronouncing your name earlier. I didn't see your chat. Thank you so much for that as well. Our next presenter is Adam Laats, Dr. Adam Laats.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everybody. And Dr. Sanders, I didn't know we were allowed to wear hats. If I had known that, it would have changed my whole approach here. So, but it's wonderful to be here. Hello, everybody. My area of concentration, I study the history of controversies about school, mostly in the 20th century. What has been lightning rods in the past. And I'd like to share just a couple of examples, one from about 50 years ago, one from 100 years ago, that I think help understand the pattern in which this critical race theory controversy fits. One of the lessons that I take away from it is that we do have we being the United States, there is a long tradition of very similar types of controversies about what goes on in K-12 schools and in higher ed. The second lesson that I take away is that when conservative activists have pushed movements like this one, they generally, traditionally or historically, haven't won directly on the issues. That is, they haven't succeeded in banning or getting rid of ideas that they don't like, or imposing ideas that they do want in public schools, especially K-12 schools. What they have succeeded, though, Emma used the phrase watching over their shoulders, teachers watching over their shoulders. That has been something that in the 20th century, and I think continuing today, has been very successful for conservative campaigns like this. One of the questions from the audience asks about, we don't want to get too far into the weeds before we know what CRT is. But I think that's exactly the part of the second lesson with conservative activism in the 20th century. And I think it holds true for today's moment. It is the weeds that is what makes these such compelling and successful campaigns. It's confusion that leads to the kind of fear that teachers and parents are worried about. Is CRT going to hurt my child? Do I need to worry about getting fired? Because it's so difficult to understand, and as Chris Rufo has said, intentionally so, it leads to confusion. The confusion leads to fear, and that has been the way conservatives have won in the past. I don't mean like a simple kind of plan or a conspiracy, although there are plans and conspiracies, but I don't mean that this whole thing is one long scheme. I do mean, though, that this is a kind of tactic of desperation that conservatives have ended up with over and over again for about 100 years now. What I've called somewhere else the politics of petulance. When they can't win, when they can't get prayer installed in public schools, when they can't insist on chapel in public colleges. Instead, they do things like this where they try to ban ideas that they consider dangerous. So with that preliminary, let me just briefly, I promise, offer a couple of examples that I think are really illustrative. The first and probably most famous for K-12 schools came about 50 years ago, a very famous episode in Kanawha County, West Virginia. In Kanawha County, and I'm talking about 1973, not 2021. But what happened was a conservative activist on a school board reviewed some textbooks and she found material that she didn't like. She thought it was anti-American. She thought it taught a bad kind of history to children. It included it was literature books. It included Black militant authors, Eldridge Cleaver most famously, but also George Jackson. And this is what seems so similar to today. This white conservative activist protested against the inclusion of Black authors because she said they would reading those things would turn white children into racists by reading these authors. And unfortunately, the other echoes are really, I think, discouraging. 2 people got shot. There was a school boycott. A dynamite bomb was set at the school board building. Elementary schools were firebombed. School buses were shot. So unfortunately, the kind of violence and tumult that we're seeing and fearing today has this long history when it comes to what kids are going to read in schools. The second example I'll use refers to, Emma mentioned some of the spate of legislation that's coming around today. In the 1920s, it wasn't, it might seem different because the word that they used wasn't about race specifically. The word that they use is one we're all familiar with. The word was evolution. But the movement to ban evolution, this is how I spent my 20s, is I read through all these laws from the 1920s. And the movement to ban evolution was not, yes, it was in the language of a scientific theory, but it wasn't about the scientific theory of evolution at all. It was about a very similar sort of vision of what American schools should be doing and especially what they shouldn't be doing. So let me, to be clear, let me just give you a couple of examples of these laws from 100 years ago. Oh, first, some numbers. There were 53 of these in 21 different states. So it was very similar to today where it burst across the country. 5 were passed, 1 resolution and 4 laws. And let me give you the language of some, so you'll see why, hopefully you'll see why I think it's so familiar to what we're seeing today. The first statewide bill that got the most attention was from Kentucky. And yes, it would ban evolution, the teaching of evolution, but it would also ban the teaching of Darwinism, atheism, and agnosticism. You know, so what would it mean for a teacher to be accused of teaching agnosticism? Furthermore, the bill would have empowered citizens. Any 2 citizens could accuse a teacher of teaching any of these things, including agnosticism, and the teacher had to be brought before the school board within 5 days and interrogated. That was the word, interrogated. And the idea was the penalty would be that they would lose their job. An additional proviso, an amendment from the Senate in the bill would have banned any book from a public library including a college library in the state of Kentucky, from any material, and I'm quoting, that will weaken or undermine the religious faith of the pupils. So how could you have a college library without any books that might weaken or undermine a student's religious faith? The broadness and the vagueness and the idea that schools existed to promote a certain vision of what was true and what was important is what I think is so similar to today. Other states did the same. West Virginia had a bill that would have banned nefarious matter from public schools. The US Congress tried to prohibit teachers in Washington, DC in 1926 from teaching anything, I'll quote again, any kind of, quote, disrespect for the Holy Bible, or that ours as an inferior government. So these went as evolution laws, anti-evolution laws, but I think just like today, that great question from the audience, the weeds about evolution in the 1920s were precisely the point. They wanted to keep it confusing because then people could fill it with what the meanings that they wanted, and they could see their lawmakers as speaking up for their vision of America. And those visions were just as ugly in the 1920s or uglier than today. I'll end with just one example from Kentucky. A person wrote into a newspaper saying, if they didn't pass this anti-evolution bill, it would mean, and I'll quote, and I'll apologize in advance, that the white man at the N-word came from the same parentage. That was in the newspaper. So voters, when they saw their lawmakers saying vague promises to ban things from schools, the vagueness wasn't accidental. It was a political necessity, and in fact, it was very politically powerful. And I'm thinking, because what people said had nothing to do with Charles Darwin or natural selection or genetic drift or any of that. It had to do with keeping schools white, Christian, and under the control of people who thought public schools should remain white and Christian. So I'll end with that. And thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Laats. Our next speaker is Dr. Kevin Bruyneel, and I will let you have your introductions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sanders, and you've got my name perfectly. So thank you so much. And I really appreciate the insights from Adam and Emma, which I think really flows in well. First of all, I want to thank the City Club of Boise for the invitation for this really important conversation. And I want to do a couple of things. One is maybe at the end sort of explain in a very basic sense what I think critical race theory is. But I agree with the panelists who've discussed thus far, that's not really fundamentally the point. But I think we do need to explain it. But I want to start with a personal example. I just visited my my partner's family in DC, which my niece, who's in grade 10, we were talking about what she was learning. She lives in DC, but she goes to school in Maryland. And it turned out, she's a very bright young woman, that she was very interested in Toni Morrison, but Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye has been banned from her local school district. And she will read it on her own, but obviously the rest of the students, the conversation won't happen. Toni Morrison is not part of the history of critical race theory as a field. She's one of the most brilliant authors of the American experiment, the American Project in Race, and her words are deemed to be a threat. And I just want to put that out there in terms of what this is about. If I was to set out my own title for this, let me just start a clock for myself here. It would not be, my title would be, this is not about CRT, this is about BLM. This is not about critical race theory, this is about Black Lives Matter. As Emma set out, the emergence of this critique of critical race theory emerges in the summer of 2020. What is going on in the summer of 2020? We have a massive election that's ramping up, and we have Black Lives Matter that is at its peak of the biggest mobilization of an anti-racist movement in the history of the country that is pushing very distinct proposals such as defund the police and to talk about the issue of structural racism. Now, there are various pushbacks. There are people who openly disagree with Black Lives Matter, who invoke all lives matter, blue lives matter. What critical race theory starts to emerge then, not as a open, direct analysis of the history of this field, but as a wedge issue to not directly talk about Black Lives Matter, to not say you were against Black Lives Matter, because then one can sound like they are a racist or they were against equality. One can then, as we do historically, and I think Adam set this out, it's not about us, it's about defending the children in the schools. And often what's going on in those moments historically is it's the adults projecting their own concerns onto the children. And so this is really about a political issue. Emma also mentioned somebody running for governor who started to present something about CRT. Always watch the politics. So one example is at Fox News leading up to the most recent election in, say, Virginia, in which the governor who won ran on an anti-CRT platform. Fox News's coverage of CRT up to the election peaked up, and after the election has almost fallen off. This is a wedge issue to talk about what's going on in the in the country as a whole about systemic racism that's pushed by Black Lives Matter. If the Black Lives Matter movement doesn't emerge as strong as it does in the summer of 2020, if in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, I believe that we would never even be having this conversation about CRT. It's a wedge issue to not directly talk about Black Lives Matter, but to talk about something called critical race theory, to look like it's a group of elites in institutions who are brainwashing the children, to deflect from what's going on in direct political movements to try to deal with systemic racism. I mentioned that first so we can be clear. This gets into the issue of the weeds that Adam is talking about. These are part of the weeds of the politics of what's going on. Pay attention to the role of politics for people trying to enter into or achieve political success and how they use this as a wedge issue to divide people and to deflect what's going on. So that's the first key, is to think about the politics here. What this is about then, and I will close by talking about critical race theory. This is a movement against talking about race in any way other than talking about the US being in a post-racial society. You can find a list from the state of Wisconsin, all the words that are proposed to be banned. It's pretty much anything that has to do with race in any way other than saying we're an equal society. So this is not about critical race theory itself. This is about any claim or discussion of race in any way that might raise the question of us living in an unequal and unjust society and how we deal with it. The list of words, and this is why I come back to Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison is one of the most beautiful, powerful writers. Certainly she's talking about race. She's talking about the human experience in the United States in some of the most brutal ways. She is not engaging in critical race theory analysis, but she is, of course, forcing us, who are readers, to deal with the reality of race in this country. And let me end then by talking about what critical race theory is and isn't in the most basic sense. One of the critiques of critical race theory that I think is either insincere or uninformed is that it's going to make our white children, and this is really about the white children, feel guilty. It's going to make them feel like they've done something wrong. Critical race theory in many ways was actually built upon not focusing on the individual and individual forms of experience and views of racism or being racist. It's formed by and developed by the history of structures of racism. Some of the founders of it, such as Professor Derek Bell, and people who developed, such as Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, are focused on the issue of the law. And so in the law and legal realm, we often focus on individual forms of violation, people who experience discrimination at an individual level. And we need to pursue those individual forms of discrimination to their just outcomes. But there's what Bell starts talking about and Crenshaw is the law, the legal system does not allow for a larger structural understanding of the history of things like redlining and segregation, the lack of intergenerational wealth, health disparities, which are not about individual white people twirling their mustaches and making the world racist. It's about the larger structure that we inherit that may not be, as I said, I teach critical race and Indigenous studies. So it's critical race and Indigenous studies, so it's the double whammy my students get, right? And I say that not a single person in this class of various races is a victim or a perpetrator. I don't know you individually, but we are all inheritors of the society we live in. We have a responsibility to pay attention to it, to learn from it. And if we want to change it, to think about the structures we need to change. And so in many ways, critical race theory is the exact opposite of the way it's been posed. Not that I think the way it's been posed is sincere. It is not about blaming individuals, because no individual has responsibility for racism. That is a very liberal sort of individualist notion. It's the history of this country. When we look at a segregated country in terms of education, in terms of health outcomes, in terms of where I am in Brooklyn right now, there's some sirens going by, in terms of housing, it's not that individuals are making that happen on their own. That's not to say we don't have the history of really horrible policymakers. It's the history of policies that we have inherited. And so what we try to do in a critical race theory class is look at the policies, look at the economics, look at the history, look at the law, think about how it's shaped the world we're in, that we may reproduce without even thinking about it, because we think that's just the way the world is. And then as people engage in politics, we think about how might we change the law or the policies or the way in which we think about housing and education as institutions, as a community, as a collective, not as focusing on individuals. In fact, critical race theory is the exact opposite of sort of shame and blame. It's thinking about policy, history, law, and institutions, and to build from there. So I'm at 6.5 minutes, so I'll stop there, and I look forward for the questions. I thank you again for the opportunity to talk to you all.
Wow, I want to thank you all for your opening remarks. I think a lot about how this connects to what I teach, the US Constitution. And I'm sure those who track it know that Idaho's beginning point was to ban social justice education, which as a constitutional law scholar, I thought, well, our constitutional document is kind of social justice-y in the way it provides for Bill of Rights and limits government. So very early here in Idaho, it was very clear to me that the lack of understanding about critical race theory, and I should say critical race theory was included in that list. It was just a very clear to me that there was a real lack of understanding about the ability to not just ban subjects, but the implications of such vague words. But of course, many of you refer to the history of this country. I think a lot of this reflects what we saw in the early 1900s, the teachings that slaves were happy and treated well, right? The teachings of the Jim Crow era, that Jim Crow wasn't so bad, comments both of which you still see in law school classrooms by professors and students, right? When you're teaching Dred Scott and Plessy versus Ferguson. And of course, this all is a part of a larger history here of racial segregation, right? Whether it's in our courtrooms, whether it's on our trains, and now in our education as far as what we can learn, because we must understand that those who are credited with creating critical race theory are some of the more prominent professors of color and women of color law professors in the country. And that seems to get sort of ignored a lot in the debate too, right? That we're seeking to ban the thought, the theory of some prominent legal theorists, while at the same time, right, approving of originalist theories of legal thought, right? That is, let's pay more attention to those who owned people than those who are creating theory to explain the history of race that resulted from the ability to own people. So I want to thank you all for the opportunity to reflect upon that. That touches what I teach quite a bit and what I see in my classrooms. We've got a number of questions coming in through the Q&A, and so I'd like to get to some of those questions. Particularly, I'd like to start with some of the local matters going on here, if that's okay. There are a number of questions pertaining to local issues here in Idaho. Particularly, there was a report about a university that was having a diversity-related program of some type. There was a false report about what the professor had actually said to a student in reaction to a student question. It appears as if that university sort of immediately shut down, not just that professor's classes on the subject, but all the classes on the subject, and launched an investigation. Turns out, right, the reported statement was never said. One of the interesting things to me is it's rarely reported that the professor involved was a female professor, which I think we all know for women in the higher education classrooms, it could be a treacherous space, right? But now here in Idaho, we have a situation where at the same university, a professor who was actually part of the anti-indoctrination panel that was put together by a member of the legislature to root out critical race theory in Idaho's schools. Apparently, this professor has made recorded statements making a number of derogatory statements about women, their place in higher education, and their place in society. And it has been pointed out that this same university that shut down classes over a rumor is now doesn't seem to be reacting to these very, as I said, recorded statements, and not recorded against the person's consent or anything like that. It was part of a speech. That the university seems to have a very much more passive reaction. And so that's a very long question. I apologize for that. But I did wonder, and I apologize if you're not sort of up to date on sort of the Idaho goings-ons, but there is sort of this tension that a number of people have identified in the chats. In the questions, which is, it seems as if there is an offense and I should mention that it seems as if the person who was offended when the classes were shut down was a white person, right? So if you offend a white person, there's this overreaction, some would argue. But when it comes to the speech of some white people, this white male professor in particular, that there seems to be a lot more concern about academic freedom, tolerance, such that we now have an imbalance in terms of the type of speech that's accepted and protected versus that speech which is investigated and looked at very closely. So if any of you have a response to that, I think a number of the members of our audience would love to hear it. And my apologies for the lack of question in the question.
Well, I can just briefly, and I'll post these links in the chat as well, because Idaho in general has given us a lot of material for writing about as recently. So a colleague of mine, Vimal Patel, did a huge deep dive into the incident at Boise State, where basically, and this is just me summarizing, but the long and short of it is there was this incident that was communicated by, it ended up being communicated by like a concerned community leader about something that happened during a class. Basically, it was alleged that a student had to, was forced to apologize, I think, for being white or for having white privilege. The student was taunted allegedly and called names by other students, and the word stupid was used. The student left in tears. The university did a big investigation contacting an outside firm, and the long and short of it was it's pretty much that didn't happen. It's almost certain that didn't happen, and yet the Boise State, I believe, suspended, as you were saying, not just the course, but the other courses that were going on at the same time, and undertook this investigation. Whereas meanwhile, and I believe the professor is Scott Unor, who has said really controversial things and written controversial things about women and gay people and trans people, and has, in my memory, been defended by, I believe, the dean, I can't remember, but has been defended by a university administrator before as, look, it might go against the institution's values, but it is within his academic freedom to explore such topics. And I think that gets at a really key tension actually in university life today that I'm really interested in, which is colleges are promising to be places that are diverse and equitable and inclusive. And sometimes that really butts up against an individual faculty member's research area or stated opinions or statements that are made publicly. And how do you balance the line between protecting that faculty member's right and freedom to have the autonomy to research and inquire and follow inquiry where they want, whereas still maintaining a safe environment for students to learn in? I find that really interesting. I don't particularly have the answer, obviously, but my colleagues did happen to write a great deal about the both of those incidents. I'll post those links in the chat. You don't have to be a subscriber in order to read those. And the other thing that's important to note in all this, and I think this was mentioned in another question, is that Marlene Trump, the president of Boise State, within her first couple of weeks was basically presented a demand by state lawmakers, 20-something, I think all House members, but I'm not sure, to not do diversity work anymore, to move away from things that are really championed or considered necessary in other at other flagships even, or at other public institutions. And I believe she arrived at Boise State in 2019. So that's been something that she's been, and her administration has been having to confront, is a pretty hostile legislature to efforts that she was trying to undertake. And so I think that's really interesting in considering kind of why certain decisions are made. My colleague Vimal gets into a lot more of the backstory in terms of the pressures that she and the university was under, and also the reasons for why people were upset with her, or upset with Boise State for suspending the class in the first place on what turned out to be just completely false, and also considering what damage did that do to the students' education. I think that's really important. It's important to hold those things kind of in both hands at the same time. So I will stop that kind of ramble now and send the links to the chat so people can see them if they're interested.
Professors Laats or Bruyneel?
I haven't been following, I'm sorry, the situation. Someone did post a question about how does someone, a person or a community, what can you do about this stuff? As Emma mentioned, one of the tensions in university life is that universities are under, sometimes, like in this case, political pressure to become a space that, in this case, conservatives in Idaho feel reflects their values. But there's also a huge, often unspoken pressure on universities to maintain at least parity with what is going on in other universities. So you don't want to become, and there's a lot of pressure, I'm sure, in Idaho and in every other state. Wisconsin is one I'm most familiar with, to keep, in spite of political pressure, to make it more, a university more in line with local political dominant values. You also want to keep the university in line with academic values, like academic freedom in this case, for example. And this was, historically, this was really big throughout the century, when university presidents who were accused of evolution or communism or any of these isms, they could often make a strong defense and say, hey, these aren't my values, these are the values of higher education. And if we want to be a respectable, a real university, we can't abandon things like tenure protections, academic freedom, scientific method. We can't close our eyes and pretend that we are only here as a cloistered little provincial institution. We have to be in the mainstream on these issues.
Sure. I mean, I also don't know much about the Idaho situation. I will speak generally about what I think, put it in historical context. In some sense, what's going on now is terrible because it's massive censorship going on. I just mentioned one example that I know of from a personal connection, but there's massive censorship going on, various school boards, in terms of dealing with any text that deals with race. That's what's going on. It's also, in its own sort of way, a indication of the success of anti-racist movements that's put the fear of conservatives. This is a reactionary moment. You have historically, you have the Reconstruction period, then you have the reaction to the Reconstruction period. You have the Civil Rights Movement, you have the reaction to that. You have the rise of the modern Civil Rights Movement and Black Lives Matter and the reaction to it. This is I'm a politics person, so I'm going to keep coming back to my bottom line here, which is when I'm teaching it and talking about it, I want to, again, it's understandably, race and gender, sexuality, colonial injustice is very personal, and people understandably personalize it and should, because one should not deny their own feelings to it. I think in the classroom, for me, in the context, is to try to distance a little bit and get a sense of the role of history, the role of institutions, and then have the conversation not about critical race theory or even about Black Lives Matter, but the history of the country within which we exist and how we got to where we are. And so in terms of how to teach it, I teach in college settings, so I can't speak to K through 12. But I think what you want to do is let's go back to think about the history, the context of how we got to where we are. And that's not an answer to the people who are the reactionaries. They don't give a darn. They're going in the direction they're going. But when I face a conversation with people, somebody mentioned John McWhorter's critique. John McWhorter's critique of CRT being a religion. John McWhorter, I've read his work. He has no idea what's going on with CRT. So I'll just say that off the bat. He just doesn't. I've been in this field for 20 to 30 years. CRT is, in some sense, an arcane, but also very important way to talk about first legal theory and the law, and then gets involved in various forms of different political institutions. And it also, in terms of being a religion, it is the most active form of religion in terms of people disagreeing all over the place. In terms of critical race theory, there are various ways in people are engaging this, who disagree, engage in peer review, think we're going in different directions. There's no one form of CRT argument. It does not exist. It's like saying history or political science or legal studies has one, or constitutional law has one view of things. It's an active form of scholarly study and approach that has different approaches to things. So it's far be it from a religion. I go to conferences when we have lively disagreements about how we approach things, but we're pretty much always thinking in terms of systems, structures, and policies. And so I think one is when you're engaging with somebody, you always try to begin with telling them the truth of something. You give it a shot. Education, I'm an educator, so I have to believe in education at some level. You try to educate, this is the reality of it. But then when they keep deflecting, like I come back to a basic question. I'll say to somebody, do you think we live in a racially unjust society? That's it. That's the question, right? If they say no, that's a different conversation. If they say yes, then I say, how do you think we deal with it? I try to come back to the basics, the heart of the conversation. And I think that sort of allows us to push off some of the third rail hot button issues about what they think or don't know CRT is. Do you think we live in a racially unjust or racially just society today, or no? And let's begin from there. And then we can have a conversation about why one thinks that and how we can approach it. That's how I approach it in classes, but also as I have conversations generally about CRT as somebody who teaches.
Thank you all. And I'd like to pick up on that last theme. We've got a lot of questions in the chat about how to properly teach or explain critical race theory, what you can do to sort of properly say it to others about what it is, what responsibility or role do educators have to properly present and teach critical race theory, if you choose to do so, right? And so I wondered if we could hear from you about, for the person who may not have the time to get into the weeds of critical race theory, but may want an opportunity or to be able to pass along to someone else, sort of, well, how do you talk about this subject? And let me pause and say, I think this is part of a larger question, right? Which is the discomfort of discussing race in this country. And I know it's a global issue, but we're gonna focus on the United States. Here, we can see from our founding documents, right, a really difficult time discussing race. One of the things that I like to point out is that the US Constitution, oddly enough, doesn't grant an affirmative right to slavery, right? And it doesn't say they'll be Black, and yet that's what happened. And so if you take that founding document and its preamble about equality, and yet the apparent difficulties of our framers to actually say it themselves in that Constitution. We're going to have slaves and they're going to be Black, right? We have a lot of other things that protect slavery, but not that particular provision. And then you see later, didn't even put it in the Bill of Rights, but a lot of hinting about states' rights, the rights of individuals and of privacy in their home, the ability to keep the government out to regulate your use of your owned individuals. So here, there's just a difficulty discussing race in this country. And so that's a little bit to what my question goes to as well. If crit has become a proxy for race, and I think in many ways it has, how do we continue to break down amongst those who are just so uncomfortable with the conversation of race that they're willing to ban an entire legal theory? Now, some would say maybe those are not people you should be discussing race with, right? Maybe you just let them have their own thoughts. But some of these people are passing laws, they're signing laws, and they're going to interpret the critical race theory bill. I get the question all the time, does this mean I can't talk about race? So that would be, I think, a way to sort of group together a number of questions about having conversations. So why don't we start this time with Dr. Laats, we'll go with Dr. Bruyneel, and we'll round it out with Emma Pettit. Oh, sorry, Pettit. Pettit, no. I had it right the first time.
Yeah, the first one is that. Well, sure. I think the most important, drawing from the history anyway in the 20th century, the most important thing to keep in mind is that with a lot of these issues, as you said, the issue is not the issue. We're not really fighting about critical race theory in K-12 schools because that's not something that gets taught. What are we fighting about? I think if we want to succeed or be productive in any school policy, K-12, I'm thinking about mainly conversation. We need to focus on what the real politically powerful issue is. And to my mind, and especially this has been the case in the 20th century, I think it's still true today, the really politically powerful idea is children's safety. On one side, you think that children are being endangered. And I think people sincerely believe this, though I don't agree at all. I think people think that their children, they're worried that their children are really being endangered by a kind of indoctrination about white guiltiness. Like, I think people really believe that. And they think that their children are in danger. So telling them that fifth grade doesn't teach critical race theory does nothing if they think their children are in danger. We need to address the fact that children's safety depend on learning an authentic understanding of the history of this country, including the difficult topics of race. If your child lives near a dangerous street, the thing to do is not to avoid or ban any discussion of traffic safety. The thing that you do is you directly address that question of child safety. We need to keep your children safe. We need to teach them why the 1619 Project is important. For example, we need to teach them what happened racially so that things, as Kevin mentioned, so that things like Black Lives Matter or Watts in 1968 or pick Chicago in 1919, Tulsa in 1921, so that these things can make sense to children and that they will actually be safer by understanding the real racial landscape that they're living in. That's what would be my advice.
Sorry, I just blanked for a second. No, I agree completely. I think that one other way to think about this too, and I agree that it doesn't really matter that CRT is not being taught. People are going to be concerned that their children are in danger or indoctrinated. I think the other way that I end up talking about it, and I'm going to go back to teaching at a college level, but also conversations, is the idea that critical race theory is about somehow promoting some agenda that's for one group and against another. And in fact, what I try to argue or articulate is actually, if we're living in a racially unjust society, which I think I can, with data, prove that is true, that has continual forms of resistance and movements and disruption and tensions, I don't think this is a healthy society for everybody. And so that actually engaging with an analysis of critical race theory or the history of race and injustice is actually the way you become a better citizen as a whole. I don't care what your identity is. This is how you're a better informed citizen as a whole. And what, the fights over education are so intense because it's in public schools or schools generally that the normative citizen is formed, right? Sense of values and commitments and what sort of citizen one imagines. And so for me, regardless of one's racial position, to be informed about the history of the country, to be engaged and informed as a citizen, as a voter, as a participant is fundamental. And so you are actually harming your children at some level if you are not informing them about this history, because eventually they're going to be out in the world. So say you shield them through K through 12. Eventually, they're going to go in and they're going to work in a company, right? They're going to end up being voters. They're going to end up in some place where, if they have not sense, to get to Adam's point of where the traffic lights are, they actually may end up really being misinformed about how they work in collaboration. And I'm not just talking about something as functional like getting a promotion, but just living with others, to have a sense of how the world works so that they can actually succeed, be informed, and actually be contributors. So to me, it's actually trying to engage with what kind of citizen do we want. And also, I do, as somebody engaged in like the political fight over race, is I think there's something about, one is there's an anti-CRT position that I think is about really talking about race. And I think there needs to be a pro-CRT position to say we need to actively mobilize. And so there has to be, what I'm hoping to see down the road is people in school boards who are actually making the pro position, to argue not so much for any sort of one doctrine, of course, but to actually to engage in the full conversation about what the country is about, so that the children can be as informed as possible, college students can be informed as possible, everybody can, and then you're going to make up your own decision when you go into the voting booth. Nobody's going to make you do what you don't want to do. And so I think that that's the other side of it, is I think we're all better off, white, Black, Asian, Native, we're all Latino, we're all better off if we have a full understanding of what this country is about. And actually, we're all safer, in my view.
And I'll just echo, I mean, what Adam and Kevin said is great and brilliant. And as a true reporter, I don't want to, overstep and prescribe anything for people to do going forward, other than to say the way, being an engaged citizen, I think, is absolutely the way to move forward with some of this stuff. I'm just going to take the opportunity now to talk a little bit more about the local context in Idaho regarding House Bill 377 and just some things to pay attention to going forward. So, because a couple of people, I believe, had asked about this in the Q&A. Basically, the governor signed into law a bill, one of these critical race theory banning bills, or rather it's the approximation of what conservative lawmakers are saying is critical race theory, not actually critical race theory. So that distinction is important. But it prevents teachers, and that applies to K-12 and state universities, from, quote, indoctrinating students into belief systems that claim that any member of any race, sex, religion, or ethnicity or national origin are inferior or superior to other groups. It makes it illegal. It makes it illegal to make students, quote, affirm, adopt, or adhere to beliefs that members of these groups are today responsible for the past actions of the groups to which they belong. So I think it's important. One point I want to mention is that, like, on its face, that doesn't sound that alarming if you're taking it at face value, that, like, okay, you can't indoctrinate a student into believing that any race is superior. Of course, that's not that's not good teaching. Like, no one is teaching out there that, like, the white race or any race is superior, but rather it's the interpretation of what feels like indoctrination, what might feel like a sense of a guilt, like provoking guilt, or these feelings, uncomfortable feelings inside students. That's really what they're out to ban. And so I think you have to keep that in mind when reading through these bills, is that a lot of the times, as my panelists have said, it's about banning discussions about race, really at all. It doesn't really matter when you listen to lawmakers talk about what they want these bills to do. It's not to the letter of what they're actually saying in the legislation, which can be a little bit confusing and et cetera. Someone asked about the consequences of that bill, and there's no enforcement mechanism that's written into the law, except for it says that no monies shall be expended by the State Board of Education or any entity under the State Board of Education's jurisdiction, or to any school district or public institution of higher education for any purpose that's prohibited in this section. So they're essentially saying, if you do this stuff, you're not going to get money. And the Idaho legislature has already shown that they're willing to do that. They approved I want to say $1.5 million cut to Boise State's budget this year because of its support for diversity and inclusion programs. So that's all to say this stuff has real world consequences, and it's something that I am sure local school districts in Idaho and institutions are thinking about, are on edge about and are considering their stances in terms of to be proactive and reactive. And so that's all to say, this is something to watch going forward. This is certainly something that you can obviously contact your state lawmakers and public school boards about, especially the school boards. That's where a lot of this stuff is getting hammered out in real time. Again, with what Adam was saying about like the fear of the children and the children's safety, you get that in the higher ed sphere a bit, but you especially get that in K through 12 because of course it's younger students. That's really where a lot of the fear of the indoctrination comes in. So yeah, I'll just echo the thanks so much for having me, and please get in touch if you have any other questions or also think the Chronicle should write about something as a shameless plug. So thanks again.
Well, I want to thank you all for such an incredibly rich conversation. I want to thank our audience for their attendance. We have so many questions in the Q&A. I think this may be my second or third event moderating, and I don't think I've seen so many questions before. I just want to end by saying that from my viewpoint of this as well, I'm really glad, Emma, that you talked about a little bit deeper the text of the bill itself. And from much of my perspective, I think about the session the year before where you had a bill that was an anti-affirmative action bill banning the taking of race and gender only thing mentioned in that bill into account, despite the fact that colleges and universities, places of public employment in Idaho are not incredibly diverse. And so I think about that coming the year before the anti-critical race theory bill and the connection between the complaints of racism and racial harassment that do occur at Idaho universities, at places of public employment. And it seems to me, linking this fear, for adults, I think there's a different fear. There's the fear of facing the consequence of your actions if you engage in behavior, right, that people may think, well, maybe that has racial indications or indications based on gender, right, or indications based on sexual orientation, right? Having to face the consequences that your behavior caused that type of disruption, I think causes many adults to become incredibly afraid. And I think a critical race theory bill like this also prevents adults from having to confront that particular type of behavior. And so I want to keep that in mind as well. Have a legal profession here that just issued a report that shows startling amounts of discrimination, harassment, and retaliation by women attorneys reporting this behavior, right? And for an institution like your bar to address that, you have to now pay attention to gender. And so think about the ways in which these bills can give an out for individuals who may not be as engaged or as committed, despite the fact that they're in jobs that call for it. And so I think we should continue to have these conversations. I think we should learn more about the incidents of racism, sexism, and homophobia that occur at our institutions, because that's also what's being concealed as well, right? What it truly is that maybe our colleges, like those plantations, are not as happy and inclusive as we think they are. So with that, I will wrap us up because we have come to 1:04 Mountain Time. I again want to thank our panelists and our audience for such an incredibly rich conversation. Happy holidays, everyone.